Okay, welcome everybody to the Global Comics Lecture Series, Alexander Zograph's Flea Market Stories. And I'm just going to go over a couple webinar tips before we begin. All audio and video are muted for all attendees. Please submit questions in the Q&A box. And then chat can also be used for general discussion. And today's session is being recorded for future viewing. And I will hand it off to Nina Couch now.
Thanks, Ian. Welcome, everyone. I am Nina Couch, Head of Area Studies and Thompson Library Special Collections at the Ohio State University Libraries, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event, part of the Area Studies Global Comics Lecture Series on Global Comics Scholarship. Beginning in 2019, global comics scholars and artists have visited the Ohio State campus in person and now virtually to present on global transnational issues from distinct area studies regional perspectives. Topics include global comics scholarships on identity and culture, disability in post-Soviet Russian comics, the power of comics in political unrest, immigration, and more. We are very grateful to our sponsors, the Ohio State University's Center for Latin American Studies, Center for Slavic and East European Studies, and East Asian Studies Center, with funds from the U.S. Department of Education Title VI grants, and to university libraries. And now, I would like to introduce Mirlu Bruzic, Coordinator of East European and Slavic Services for the Ohio State University Libraries. Mirlu? You need to unmute, Mirlu. Mirlu, you need to unmute.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Nina. Our today's guest is Sasha Rakezic, who is better known by the pen name Alexander Zograf, and he is a Serbian cartoonist whose work hunts to the heart of life in former Yugoslavia. He portrays the region's emotional twisting and impossible conditions in a dark yet amusing manner. And Sasha has been active on the international scene since the early 1990s, when his work began to appear in American comics, anthologies such as Weirdo 00, and when Seattle's Fantagraphics Books published several of his titles. Also, a British publisher, Slabo Concrete, did publish a number of his books, and works by Sasha Zograf have been translated and published in many European magazines, in L'Association in France, Cuento Zero and Black Velvet in Italy, Jochen Enterprises in Germany, Službeni Glasnik in Serbia, VBZ in Croatia, Kapsimi in Greece, Neo Tikinjev in Hungary, and Under Comics in Spain. Zograf's work has been exhibited in various venues all around the globe, and in 2003, New York Whitney Museum hosted an exhibition entitled American Effect. And in its catalog, it did contain an 8-page story, How I Met America by Sasha Rakezic. Since 2003, he has published a weekly 2-page comic in the influential independent Serbian News Weekly magazine, and selections from his work in Vreme have been published in book form in Serbian, Italian, Greek, French, German, Japanese, Portuguese, and Hungarian. And without further ado, please let us welcome our today's guest, Sasha Rakezic.
Thank you, Miroljub, and thank you, Nena. I'm glad to speak to you today about my work in comics, and especially my special kind of niche interest, which is flea markets. I've been publishing for a long time on the international scene, and in the 90s I was published by Fantagraphics and later by Top Shelf. But since 2003, I'm publishing with Vreme magazine, which is an independent weekly from Belgrade. This is the cover of their 30th anniversary issue, which I illustrated. So, sorry, it's a magazine which is owned by the journalists. It's not owned by any company or political party, and it's the advantage of this magazine, and it's also a problem because journalists are such bad managers. So we are paid very badly for what we do, but we have a lot of freedom. And since I started to publish comics since 2003, there is, and it's 2 pages in color every week. Those of you who are maybe artists or cartoonists know that it's a lot of work. And so the overall number of the pages that I published with Vreme is now over 1,000 pages or something like that. And I've been also collaborating with the Italian magazine Internazionale, who very often publish my work there. And it's also a weekly magazine. So I will tell you something about the stuff that I collected on the flea markets. And I'm lucky that in my town, which is Pančevo, it's a town across the river Danube from Belgrade. And in my town, there's a strong tradition in flea markets for some reason. For decades, it was operating. Some people told me that it was probably even earlier in the 1930s that the flea market started here. And this is just one of the examples. Once when I was in the flea market, I have found somebody's, it looked to me like a diary. I paid it, I don't know, 10 cents. I bought it for 10 cents from the vendor. And when I went home, I realized that it's not actually a diary. It was written by somebody who was so stressed during the 1940s events in Serbia and Yugoslavia that he sat in front of his, I think, table and wrote down all of his life. So it was the kind of a memoir of a known person, somebody that I don't know even his name. I just know his first name, which is Radoslav. And I decided to put his story in comics. So he was describing actually one of the most important points in his autobiographical notes was the Allies bombing of Belgrade in 1944. Belgrade was heavily bombed in 1941 by the Nazis, but then it was also bombed by the town was also bombed by the Allies, by the American and British airplanes who were bombing the Nazis. So it was again very difficult for the people, and the civilian casualty was very high. Anyway, this man, he was watching the football match somewhere in the outskirts of Belgrade when he saw the planes, and just like so many other people, he tried to find his rescue close to the hospital, close to the nearby hospital, which was marked by the huge Red Cross sign. And most of the people, they thought that nobody will bomb the building with that symbol on it. Unfortunately, it was also bombed, the hospital, and Radoslav, the one who described his life in these notebooks, he went to one of the trenches, and from the trench he heard some woman crying for help, and that was when he went out of the trench to help her. But and at that moment there was an explosion of the bomb which fell right in the trench where he was previously hiding. So by helping that woman, he actually saved his life. And he also described really gruesome detail that while he was helping this unknown woman, that a severed hand was cut off by some of the people who were in the trench, and it fell on them. And at the very end of this, it's a 10-page story, and it abrupt suddenly. He was explaining that he was thinking about his life and he was also contemplating the meaning of life and what is going on to him, and that's the end of the story. And so this story for me was important to transfer to a comic format, because it was something that just by the chance came across myself, and it was actually speaking about how the common people, how the people from the street, what they felt during such difficult times, like the Nazi occupation in the 40s. And I think it's also important, because if you want to know the historical facts, you should not only read the history books, you should also try to find out how the regular people, how the people on the street, what were they feeling, and how they managed in a situation like that. And this comic, which was based on this notebook found on the flea market, was later transformed into an exhibition by the National Library in Belgrade, and it was traveling the world. So this story about the unknown man was actually reaching a lot of different countries and quite a wide audience. It was also exhibited at the Library of Congress in Washington, among other places. And so sometimes when I work on these comics, I use the material which is basically a found material. So it's not something that I draw. It's something that I find in the books mostly from the flea market. And again, you can see here there's a school book from France, which is basically speaking about the common life facts, and it was before the political correctness. So the topic is the butchery of the animals, and the second section of the that you can see is from the Serbian school book, which was about the mathematics. So most of the things explained about most of the numbers, it's connected with the pictures from the rural life, which was interesting for me, because today it would hardly be something that would end up in a school book. And then this is an Australian school book, where it's shown how these children are bad citizens, so they do things that are not allowed. And it's also interesting because it shows the negative example. And for me, this negative example was equally interesting as something else. One of the most very much present things in my comics are the old photographies, and you will find them on the flea markets all around the world. Usually, it's in almost any place in any country. It's when people die, their families, they just throw out their photos, and they end up somehow by somebody at the flea market. They got picked up by somebody who just take them basically from the garbage can or something like that. And the great thing about the photos is that the old photos are really beautiful, and they are somehow very expressive and quite interesting. So I'm using those photos, and I actually try to make a story just by looking at them and by commenting what's in a photo. And I have a friend who is a photographer, and he told me that some of the best photos were actually made by the amateurs. And it's probably true, because they have they have a freedom of shooting pictures, a freedom and some sort of relaxation, which is sometimes quite good. And especially with these old cameras, it may give very nice results. So I think it's interesting to collect these images and to work on them, to try to make them alive again, because they were almost supposed to end up in the trash, basically. And then sometimes you can even find something that you don't expect to find on a flea market. Pančevo is my hometown. Was a place where in the April of 1941 happened a war crime by the Nazi occupants, who wanted to put fear into the local people. So they took random hostages, 36 of them, and they killed them in the public execution, which was made in front of their own families. So it was very cruel. It was a horrible event. 36 people were killed. And in the 90s, it actually made a sensation in Germany. You can see here the front page of Der Spiegel, because it was obvious from these photographies that it was Wehrmacht who committed these crimes. It means the regular army, because prior to this, it was usually said that all the crimes were done by the SS and other elite units. And this was showing that sometimes it was just the regular soldiers who were killing people. So I found these photos, and they were showing the actual event. Some people were hanged and some were shot. And I donated these photos to the local museum, because I think it's important to share the knowledge with the people who are experts in what was going on here, historians, and also people who just would like to know about what was going on here during the Second War. And so, but I also made a two-page story just by these photos, probably made by some of the German soldiers. And the expert told me that these were previously unknown photos. So even things like that you can find on a flea market. And very often I browse through the old magazines, because I think it's also one of the very important resources of information. I would just buy them on the flea markets, and then I would try to find the story inside. One of the reasons is actually because we are forgetting our own collective history. Something happens and it could change somebody's life, but it is getting forgotten. Just like we throw out the old papers and we don't think about it, but there is a lot of stories which are sometimes very dramatic and very interesting. For example, when I was speaking about the town in eastern Serbia, Zaječar, I described one of the events which is completely forgotten. It was I found an article about a man who returned from the hell of the World War I, and while he returned from war, he started to act strangely, and he was talking like he was predicting the future or something, and he was talking about all the bad things that human race was doing. So he did something which I think is one of the quite extreme thing to expect from any human being. What he did is he destroyed his own house and he put it on fire, and he started to live in a hole in the ground that he dug up before that, and it was really strange to enter such a scenario, such a life scenario, because I think it's one of the craziest things that I have ever heard. And you know, it was just in the paper. It was published once in the 1930s, and then it was completely forgotten. And I believe that these stories, which are of course escaping the regular history, are actually a very powerful resource if you want to know about the human situation, the very soul of human being, and how does he feel in the historical occurrences. And also in the old magazines, in the old papers, I find a lot of old commercials, which I think they were really great, much more interesting than commercial of these days. These are some of the commercials published in the Serbian press in the 1930s, maybe 1920s as well, and they were just beautiful. I always thought that it was a kind of a golden age of graphic expression, because even the commercials were interesting. I mean, if you look at the commercials that are published today, they are boring and stiff and lying. These old commercials, even when they try to trick you, somehow it was done in a beautiful way and in a very interesting, with very interesting drawings and graphic expression, which could, I think, even now look very inspirative. So it's great to try to track elements of the press from the past like this, and I'm trying also to present them in some of my comics. Once I have also found the driving test tutorial from the 1940s. It was probably owned by some German soldier, or maybe by somebody from the local population, because my town until 1944 consisted of half of the population was Serbian and half was German. So this could be also a trace of the possession by some local German. So it's a driving test from the times of the Third Reich. And the interesting thing is that you can trace the ideology even in such a little booklet, which would, booklets like this, they are printed in any time and they would get forgotten. But it was funny to see that in the time of the Nazism, the ideology was obvious even in such publications. So it also explained that if the policeman stops you, he can ask you for a driving license, but also he can ask if you have paid your taxes and stuff like that. And these are some other examples. For example, this picture in the middle said who has the advantage on the crossroads, and the answer is it's the pedestrians who are pushing the cannon. And also, if there is a procession with the Nazi flags, you have to stop your car. It's all little life elements which I think are precious now, because I speak about the circumstances that people had to go through in that time. And for me, it was always interesting. I never cared that much to present things from the regular history. I was more interested into this history of the humankind, of the small guy from the street. And this is the comic that I published with Seattle Weekly, and it speaks about Seattle from the beginning of the 20th century. The bizarre thing is that I found a book published in Seattle, but in Serbian language, by the immigrants who were actually going from the immigrants from the Balkans who were settling in the States. And the author of this quite interesting little booklet is Petar Luburic, who is he is the writer who was quite interested into the situation of the regular people in the early 20th century. And also he was writing about the workers, but even prostitutes. So he went to Bordello, where he met a young woman, and he was telling her that he came there not as a client, but to speak to her. And the reason was that he was actually interested into her life story, about her social background, and generally it was interesting. And the editor of Seattle Weekly, he asked me how did you find this information about Seattle from 100 years ago on your flea market and in another language. But I think if you just look carefully, you can find a lot of really nice stuff on the flea markets. So, and this is example of something that I have found right on the street. So it's not the flea market find, but it's connected with something that I would just stumble upon on the street of Belgrade. It was the love letters from the 1950s, and I was just walking in the central part of the town when I saw something which turned out to be several love letters. So I was able to reconstruct the situation between two people in these described in these letters, and it was interesting because it was, of course, connected so much with the emotions and with the real life problems, and it ended up with violence because the couple separated. But all of that I found out just by looking at something that I found on the pavement. And I think it's, for me at least, it was something that told me that the story is everywhere. The stories could be found in just any part of this universe. And not just the stories, but also emotions, people with their thoughts. And it all ended up in some of my comics, all the things that I would find. Actually, when I was in Bulgaria a few years ago, I have found this object also on the street. It was done by a child, so it's his or her version of Mickey Mouse, and for me it was really interesting, and I picked it up from the pavement again, And you see that on the other side, there's a portrait of a human. And from this, I had the idea about something that I call minor discoveries concept. It is that when we walk through this world on a daily basis, we can find little things, not something great, not huge monuments, not important life-saving books or anything, but small objects, small things which are left behind by the people who are our neighbors, who are human beings, who have their thoughts. And for me, it's very refreshing to find some of the traces like that, especially because some of that is just the result of the random event. It's not something that you can plan. It's something that you just find on the street. And I think every day I try to pick up one thing which could be valuable for this reason or another. And it could be really a small thing. So I call this minor discovery. If I find something, if I read something that that is interesting, if I find something on a flea market or on the pavement or just in the jungle of internet, it's something that that just drives my attention for a day or for a life, but it's something that that leaves some trace inside. So that's what minor discovery is. And this is one of the minor discoveries that I'm quite proud of. I found it on a flea market, and it's an object. It's a pencil sharpener, and it has the shape of a Minnie Mouse, and it's actually dressed in something which looks like it could be Bulgarian or Romanian traditional dress. And the funny thing is that it has the lower part of this character looks suspiciously like Donald Duck. So it's a combination of Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and traditional culture, and it's a pencil sharpener. So it's something that really attracted my attention, and I was really happy to observe such a thing, that it exists, and it's a kind of a miniature sculpture for me. So it was for that week, it was my minor discovery. Then I also like to use a lot of material created by the other people. Sometimes even my readers, they send me some of the stuff. For example, this was found by one reader. It was in a form of a scrapbook found in a flea market. And it was written in the 1940s by a teenager back then. And he was a Boy Scout, and at the same time, it was the beginning of the Second World War. So he was describing his regular life, and which included airplanes and bombings, but also his strolls into nature, and he even wrote the poem in a fake Indian alphabet and stuff like that. So for me, it was really interesting, and also because he was illustrating and photographing some of the things that he saw around him. So once he did it just for his own pleasure, and it ended up in my comic. and it was read by probably thousands of people in decades after it was created. So it was actually a funny combination, I think, of things. And he was honest when he was creating these things, because there's nobody to to fake, to lie. So it was his honest impression about the world that he was living, and his drawings are also quite interesting, even for us in this age. It's something that could be observed and looked with interest. And I also wanted to say something about another interest, which is not connected at all with flea markets, but it's connected with the things that I find around me. It's archaeology. My parents, they built a summer house in the east of Serbia, in a place called Gamzigrad, which is very interesting, also archaeologically wise. And because of the strong force of the erosion in the eastern Serbia, you can find a lot of things from the past right on the surface. And for example, this is the fragment of the vessel from the Bronze Age that I found. I just have to clean up the leaves and to search for materials like this. And this is how it looks when it's cleaned. So in some way, it's like searching for the things at the flea market, because it's mostly found things and made by man. And speaking about the other people, other human beings from different time, the interesting moment for me in this is that they lived in the same place where we have a house. So it's like they are, in some way, they are like neighbors from different time. And past some years, I was very much interested into archaeology, and I learned a lot about the different cultures which are living there. So most of this material is not hasn't ended up yet in my comics, but it surely, I think, speaks about the curiosity for the stuff which is created by the other people. For example, this is how it looks. As you see, it's another vessel from the Bronze Age, and we are stepping on it. We just don't know how to recognize them in most of the cases. So we are ignorantly stepping on these things, and we don't understand that it was made by somebody. For example, this fragment is 4,000 years old, and it was made by another human being from another time, and that is what excites me a lot. So you can see this fragment is actually a part of a large vessel, which was used as a portable heater. You were able to light a fire inside this vessel, and on the bottom of this fragment, you can see a trace of a hole, which was actually, it serves so to make oxygen coming inside and burning up the fire. And this was one of the craziest thing that I came across. It's the piece of the vessel, which ended up somehow on a tree. So I remember when I was passing through this small forest. Uh, this is maybe not obvious from the photo, but this fragment, ceramical fragment, was actually in the level of my eyes. So from the distance, I was able to recognize it, and I realized that it was another fragment from the Bronze Age vessel, and it was on a tree. It was quite unusual thing. It's hard to say how did it ended up there. I heard from the locals that there was a whirlwind just before I have found this. So it could be that the wind has, that whirlwind was actually moving the tiles from the people's roofs. So it was very strong. So it could be that this piece of ceramics, which was on the ground, ended up on a tree this way. We don't know. But, and it's a mystery, and it's something that also attracts me, because you have to think about these things, and you are related to them once that you find them, as I think we are always related to the things that we find. It could be something that we find on a flea market, or it could be something that we meet in our lives, but it's always telling us something, and we have to be cautious, and we have to try to understand the things which are coming our way. So I guess most of these comics are actually speaking about these things. And so this is the fragment of the ceramical piece which I saw on the tree when it was cleaned up. As you can see, it's actually the upper part of a vessel and a fragment of a handle. And you can see, actually, you can find these things not only in some special places. You can find these archaeological bits and pieces even in a town. For example, this is a parking lot in my town, and there's a cobblestones, but interesting thing is that there is a gravel which was there is a segment of gravel which was probably positioned there in order to level the cobblestones, and the gravel was probably coming from the river Danube. River Danube is only few kilometers away from this spot, and I have found a number of archaeological objects there. So it's just in the middle of the town, in the middle of the day, you go and find archaeological pieces. The top one is the thing that you see on the top of this photo. It's a flintstone which was used for making of knives in the prehistoric times, and it was also used by the people in the Balkans in the more recent times. But the interesting thing is that this is the raw piece, so it was used. You can see, if you would turn this flintstone, you could see that it was used by somebody, that it was cut on some parts, and it's very sharp. It was used for the knives, and great thing about that material is that it was of wide use in a normal life, and it's not possible to find it in the nature near my town. So it was probably used by the people, and it somehow ended up in a parking lot. You just had to recognize these things. And there are also fragments of probably there is one coin and some fragments of, which were part of the equipment in some ancient time, something like that. But so it's hard to say what these objects are because they're out of the context. But it's great that you can observe them, that you can think about them, and that it could be done. It could be your minor discovery for a day. You can just walk in some. You can walk in a town and find things like that. So for me, it's quite important to be prepared that something could be found out there on the street. And if you are conceiving stories, and especially if you work on a weekly stories, you would need material every now and then. And so what I do is even when I walk, I'm trying to be curious and to find new things. And some of them they end up in my comics. And I think I'm quite a happy guy that I'm lucky. I'm lucky that I can work like this and that I can observe this great universe with care. And basically, that's what I wanted to say. I just wanted also to show you this is the latest find from the flea market. I came across this book a week ago, last Sunday, on a flea market in Pančevo. And it's a book that speaks about the petty thieves and about little criminals from the beginning of the 20th century. It's very interesting because it speaks about how the small criminals were operating and how they were living, what were they thinking, and it tells you something about life. So it is going to be my next project to do a story based on these finds. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. I think we have another 40 minutes or so, and there are several questions that we received in chat. I just wanted to thank you very much for mentioning Gamzigrad, Felix Romuliana. I'm not sure how many of today's participants know that on the territory of today's Serbia, 16 Roman emperors were born. So there is a rich history with Mesolithic and Paleolithic findings like Gamzigrad, obviously, which is younger, but we have Lepenski Vir and Vinčačka Kultura. Anyway, let us start with these questions. The first question that I'm seeing here says, Sasha, good to see you. It's from Vladislav Beronia, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. Are there plans of publishing an English translation, or rather is there interest in these comics from English language publishers?
Yeah, well, at this point, I'm somehow more turned toward European publishers. I publish a lot in Italy and France, and I was past few couple of years ago published also in Japan. So for this reason or another, I was not that active in the English language countries. I wish that I will be able to maybe publish some of my newer works in the States or in the UK. But at this moment, I'm more active in Europe. Also in my own country, when I was working on my comics in the 1990s, most of the stories were actually written in English language and first published in the States. Now I somehow returned to to my to my own country, to my own language as well, and I'm trying somehow to think about things, to think about this part of the world, and to try to understand it. Actually, all these decades were actually in some way were actually based on uh, um, my effort to understand where I'm living, what is the culture that I'm growing up, what kind of country it is, what is the history of the Balkans, and what could it tell me. So I hope that that in the future I will have more work in English language, but at this point it's more easy to find my stuff in Italian or French or Japanese.
Well, the second question came from anonymous attendee. Since you have published the story from Radoslav's memoir, has anyone who has read your comic claimed to know who the person is or was?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I never met the people that I was talking about in my comics, and it's a strange thing because it must be hundreds of people that I mention in my stories, but this far I haven't met any of them. I haven't met even the people who might be related to them in some way, this way or another. So it's maybe something that yet has to happen, but no, at this moment, I really don't. I'm not sure about this, about the story about behind these people. I'm quite curious to find out, and I hope that it is going to happen someday.
The next question is from Dragan Radanovic. I'm sorry. Do you ever draw in the flea market?
And that's the only thing that I haven't done in a flea market. No, I'm actually more into doing research, into trying to see what is being sold. And sometimes people ask me, how is it that how is it possible that I find all these interesting things on the flea market? But I think the secret is just to look over everything. So you should just be uh, patient and browse through everything you see. And sometimes something interesting pops out. I mean, for the most of the time, it's not really so exciting things that you will find. It's just the regular stuff. But occasionally there could be a great find. So it's also it's one of the elements which makes it all very exciting because you never know what you are going to find. So it's like it's like an adventure. You go to the flea market and you just let things happen. And I would never really make drawings in such places because I prefer to sit at home and to devote my time to drawings in the safe environment of the home.
This time we have a comment from anonymous attendee. I'll just read it. It says, comment, not question. I would have loved to learn arithmetic from such amusing pictures as bear carrying away one of the beehives and of two lambs running away because the little shepherd girl fell asleep on the jobs.
Yeah,
And next question is, please.
I think it shows how even the school books could be interesting. I think today just everything is somehow not so exciting, or maybe I'm prejudiced, but I think in the 1920s and 1930s it was like a focus reality for the 20th century, and even for today's standards, the photos were really great, and the clothes that people were wearing was great. and furniture, everything. So I guess that there is something, some element which is maybe, or maybe it's just attractive to artists. I'm not sure. And you have to know that the 20s and the 30s were actually quite difficult times for the most of the humanity. It was the time of the economical crisis and the rise of the fascism. So it's not the beautiful time, but somehow it produced a beautiful craft and beautiful art, I think.
Hope in that type of expression. Patrick Moriarty, I guess his friend, hi Sasha, and here I've been to flea markets with you in Pančevo. Have you ever had a person talk to you after reading Vreme, who saw their flea market items, photos, or story in the magazine? Has anyone ever complained or expressed gratitude to see it published?
Actually, some of the people that I'm meeting at the flea market, they know about my activities as a cartoonist, but you know, it's not so good because they raise the price when they see you. You know, I'm one of the important things that I haven't said before is that I'm not a collector. I don't believe in collecting things, and I never resold anything that I bought on the flea market. I'm buying only cheap things, and I believe that that it should be not fetishized. It's just the product of the people, and we have to have respect, but it shouldn't be idolized in that respect, and it should not be the result of the business transactions. You know, I think the good thing about the flea markets in the Balkans is that still most of the people who are selling there are not collectors. They are just the people who throw out things from their sellers, or they are sometimes even the people who pick these things from the trash can. But and I'm very thankful because myself I would be embarrassed to do something like that. But you know, it's always great when you come across something which is interesting, like this book that I showed you, that I found last Sunday on the flea market in Pančevo, and I paid for it $2. So it's like nothing, you know. And it's a very interesting cultural item because it's largely forgotten, and it speaks about the life in different times.
I don't know how much in use is that word kesaroshi in Serbian today. I've been away from Serbia for 40 years, but
Yeah.
I don't think that the younger generations are maybe using that word anymore. The next
There
question.
sorry. There are people who are collectors even in Serbia, and they come. Some of them, they are even coming to the flea markets in order to buy things that they would later keep in their precious collections, or they are selling it. But I just say that I'm not part of that scheme. I'm just a curious guy who likes to see something interesting.
I was talking about the title of the book, Kesaroshi. That's what,
oh yes.
I'm not sure if the younger generations are using that expression. Probably
not.
Probably not. That's why it's interesting, even from the linguistic point of view.
Yes. It's actually from the time when people were collecting their when they had their money in not in a wallet, but in little bags. I don't know what's the term in English. And pouch, yes. So kesaroshi, it means the pouch people, basically.
Pickers, yeah.
Pickers.
The next question is from Chris Lanier. First, it's a real pleasure to hear you, and I really miss having your work translated into English on a semi-regular basis. My question has to do with the way you save stories that have otherwise been lost in history or lost in a cultural memory. I wonder if you see some pattern in the type of stories that get forgotten Are they forgotten because of the accidents of history? Or does modern culture want to forget or try to suppress these types of stories?
There are both things are involved. We have this kind of a regular historic books, which are basically more connected with the consensus of the society about what the history should be. And so it's always the history written by, basically approved by politicians and executed by the clerks who work at the institutions of the society. And other than that, we have the stories by the real people. We have a little guy on the street, and we can learn a lot from him, because all the universe contains is speaking to him, to this guy from the street, you know. So if you want to know about a specific time or specific place, it's more likely that you will find valuable information from that little guy than from the history books. I mean, I'm also reading history books, and I don't say that they should be all burned or something like that, but it's not enough. And I think even the contemporary history is relying on the stories, on the narratives of the regular people, because it's important if you want to get the bigger picture. So sometimes we forget these interesting stories that are happening in our world because we are ignorant, but sometimes it's also because the society in large don't want to remember these things, because it thinks about it as something peripheral.
Next question is from Nikolai Sekulov. Thank you very much for the presentation. When writing the comic about the memoir of the unknown man, did you have to take any liberties in assuming his character and worldview?
Of course, it's my interpretation of what this man was talking about himself. So it's always a kind of it's just a kind of a rendition of what he might be and what he wanted to say. And so it's, I mean, it's a work of art. It's not a documentary, but it's I used his own words, and I tried to speak for him, whoever he was and whatever he was he was experiencing. I wanted to advocate his little point of view, and I tried to make a honest work based on his honest words. And I think that this connection with the unknown people is especially interesting, because then it puts you into a lot of challenges, because you have to think about the things that that person was had in mind when he was describing all these things, and you have to adapt it to the format of the graphic novel. It's all challenging, but it's all fun, and I enjoyed it. I mean, for me, it was like a game, something that that was meant to for joy. Even he was describing really difficult situations that he went through. It was something that for me was valuable, because it was telling me about another man's thoughts, about experience of somebody that I will never meet, because he's probably not alive by now. But it was really a great pleasure to try to tell his story to the rest of the world in some way.
This question is from David Lasky. Thank you, Sasha. You have a great eye for finding overlooked items. I'm wondering what becomes of the items after you've chronicled them. Have you amassed your own archive?
Yeah, I have my own archive, which is growing, of course, bigger and bigger every day. And I have a problem to store all these things. I never sell them because I'm not interested into that. So they are somewhere in my room, and I like to go back to them and to browse to them from time to time, to have a direct contact with them, to touch these publications, these books, the manuscripts. It's always quite interesting to actually touch these things, to to sense that somebody else was using his own energy uh, to uh, uh, to just leave it behind. And of course, it's a problem to store these things, but it's a nice problem. I mean, you can always find some way, especially because I have some objects, but it's not a huge collection, for example, of sculpture or something like that. It's mostly books and letters and cards and stuff like that. So you can find a way to actually just put it somewhere. But sometimes, who knows, maybe I'm going to open up my archive to also other researchers. Even now, if I find something which is interesting for the other people, like these photos from the shootings in Pančevo in 1941, I share it with other institutions, museums, and archives. And I think it's important also that it's available to other people, because that's one of the things that I don't like about collectors, is that they try to somehow keep it for themselves, and they just they observe these fine items as something that was meant just for them. But I think it's something that everybody should, it's everybody should enjoy these things, even if they are quite unimportant for the larger picture. But I mean, usually it's just a little things like forgotten books and letters and photos, but they should be shared in some way. And by publishing these comics, I'm trying actually to share these experiences with other people.
It's very important that you mentioned this shooting in Pančevo. It could be that perhaps some surviving members of the Volksdeutschers families brought them out, although there were many of them who had to move from former Yugoslavia under communist regime and go back to Germany. I remember a few years ago, a History Channel had even a video, which was one of the rare documents, video recorded documents, how Wehrmacht was really right there when, and they mentioned the city of Pančevo
Yes.
was doing these atrocities. So it does give another element of these very sad moments in the history of mankind during World War II.
Yes, somebody was actually filming it while it was happening in 41, and it was shown. He kept it for decades in his own collection. It was a footage made in color, and it was shown for the first time in a German TV program in the 1990s, and it made some attention in Germany. And I mean, even up to this day, it was one of the well, it's maybe bad to say something like that, but it's one of the best documented atrocity of the Nazi regime which happened in Europe, because at that moment in 1941 it was April, and the Nazis were thinking that they were so powerful they were omnipotent, and that they could or they should kill people in front of everybody. And so it was at that moment it was free to actually record such an event. After this, later in 1941 and until the end of the war in the Balkans, there were even much bigger atrocities, but they were not filmed, and it was forbidden to make your own private photos of such events. So this was important for the history of Europe in some way, not just the town of Pančevo, because it was one of the best documented atrocities during that difficult period.
Not to mention what happened a few months later with the killing of almost 7,000 students in Kragujevac, in Kraljevo, etc. So, yeah. Andrea Plazzi, ask you this question. You travel the world, but in your comics, there are recurring places like Gamzigrad, which surely is an inspiring place for you. Would you please expand on that?
Yeah, well, it's a strange story. I'm living actually in the north of the country, in a big plains, and it's a quiet part. But my father, at some point in the 1970s, he went together with some friends who lived in the eastern part of the country, and he came across this place, Gamzigrad, and he just saw a little hill, and he understood from the first moment that he saw it that he's going to build a house over there. And it was out of the way. It was in the nature. Especially at that moment, there were no neighboring houses surrounding it. Now there are a few houses around, but at that moment in the 1970s, it was just the only house in that part of Gamzigrad, and so I came there with my parents, and since that part of the land was in a little forest, me and my mother and my father, we had to cut the trees and to clean up the space in order to even start to build the house. And when I was a kid, I was really confused, like, what are we doing here in the middle of the nowhere? But in the later time, I understood how important that place it is to me, to meditate, to think about what you've been through past years, to think about life, to just observe things. It's a perfect place, and so every summer I go there, and by a coincidence, it's a very important place archaeological wise, from the time of the prehistoric cultures until and also in the time of the Romans, as you said, it's Felix Romuliana was very important place in the Roman time, because one of the Roman emperors was born in that place, and so it has, but it's still a little bit out of the way. It's quiet, and it's not hugely populated. It's just not quite as discovered. It's not quite discovered by the tourists as maybe some other places, and so it's a perfect place to stay there and to think about everything, I think.
Yeah, that entire area around Danube River is very rich in history.
That's true. That's true. Yes.
Ioana Luca says, thank you so much for the fascinating presentation. How do you relate to other people's lives when you draw them, when you speak for them, quote unquote? Do you also dramatize your relationship, emotional or otherwise, with them in your drawings?
Yes, sometimes some of these stories are basically are actually based on what the other people tell me about their own experiences. So I use this journalistic approach. I try to speak to the people and to make a comics based on what they tell me. And even if I use just the material from the flea market, it's all about how I perceive the thoughts of the other people. I enjoy that because I think one of the bad things about artists is that they somehow speak about themselves. They they are so they are kind of self-centered because they speak about their life. It's always them in the center of the attention. But I think it's great if an artist can also relate to the other people, if he can use his creative energy to actually listen to other people, to tell their stories and to try to hear them, you know. So I'm trying actually to understand the world through the others. A lot of the time I'm also like deep in my thoughts, but I'm also using every opportunity to listen to other people and what they have to tell me, because you can always find something from the people. And by using other people as the topic of your comics, you somehow are trying to understand others, understand the world that you are living in, and it's also fun because it's the human nature is to actually share their thoughts with other people. That is the characteristic of our race, and you know, even archaeology is telling us that people were always exchanging their concepts, their thoughts, their fashion, their food, and everything. So civilization is in a to a large extent it's connected with the exchange of ideas.
I think this is the third anonymous attendee. I'm not sure if it's the same person or not, but it's more of a comment. Someone found a couple of photo albums at the flea market compiled by a student at a local college in 1919 and 1920, and they donated the scrapbooks to the college archives. 10 years ago, I was working at the archives, looked through those albums and found some photographs of my grandmother that I had never seen before. And from Patrick, Reality again. Also, don't forget to mention that mammoth tooth you found, Sasha.
Yeah, that was a funny incident because we had the comics festival in Pančevo, in my town, that I was conducting for a few years, and at one point one of the participants to the festival, he has paid for a billboard in a town in Pančevo to display one of his comics. So we all had, I mean, it was, there were, I don't know, 20 or 30 guests from many different countries who came for the festival. And so we all together went to see this billboard. And at some point I saw something close to that. Everybody was looking up at the billboard, but I was looking down. And what I saw next to it was a mammoth tooth, you know. And I was able to recognize it because I have already I already had one in my home. For the most of the people, when they see something like that, they just don't know what it is. But I called up everybody and I said, look at this thing. And it was in the middle of the day, in the middle of the town. And again, it was probably through a gravel that it was placed there, because the people who were working on the side of the road, they just brought some gravel from the river Danube, and there were these remains of a mammoth, you know, old, probably hundreds of thousands of years that ended up in the middle of the town. So suddenly it was all the attention was on that. It was fun.
You come from Serbia. I was just wondering if I might ask this question. Actually, I have two comments. The first one is that this, for almost 100 years, that country had comics. Do you think that this had to contribute? I mean, that the origin was somewhat linked to the influx of monarchist Russian officers who came after the revolution, and most of intellectuals and intelligentsia stayed in Belgrade, in Warsaw, and Paris. I know that they had to do all sorts of different jobs. Do you think that they had somehow contributed the most for Serbian cartoonists, or there were other elements, more of the autochthone provenance?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting case that Serbia was a place with such a rich comic scene way back in the 1930s. There were a lot of the local artists who were actually trying to create their own comics. Very shortly after American comics were introduced by the local daily papers like Politica, and very soon afterward, after that, there were a few of the papers from Belgrade, newspapers, that started to publish American comics. And the surprising thing is that some of the people who were reading it, they immediately started to draw their own comics. And the whole scene exploded in the second part of the 1930s with dozens of local cartoonists. And one of the interesting things is that a lot of them were actually Russian immigrants who came after the revolution to Belgrade. And still, it's not quite clear why the majority of the local artists were white Russians. Some of them were the local Serbian people, but a majority of them were Russians. One of the things that we think happened is that Russians who came there after revolutions were basically immigrants, and they had to take just any job, and comics were any job, because it was by the most of the people who finished academia or something. It was like a lowbrow art, something which was not so important. But if you were an immigrant, you would take just any job. And we were lucky that they didn't think about it only as a job, but also as a passion. So there were a lot of really nice comics being produced in the 1930s and 1940s Belgrade, which is a kind of a surprise, because it was the mostly rural country in the 1930s. Most of the people lived in the villages, but by some wonder, comics were becoming very popular and very fast. Their popularity was growing very fast. It's hard to say why it happened, but perhaps also because the comics magazines were also becoming quite popular. Some of them were publishing 2 or 3 times every week, which was unusual for the comics format. But and they gained a huge readership very fast. So it made some stir on the cultural scene, and a lot of people have started to think about comics as modern media for that time, and quite expressive. And we were lucky that it exploded in the 30s, but mostly it was stopped when the Second War started, because Nazi occupation was quite heavy, and also because the largest archive of the comics magazines, which was held in the National Library in Belgrade, has been destroyed completely by the Nazi airplanes. It took years to actually recreate what was collected until 41, and the collection of comics was never recreated in full. So even today, there are just a few collections, private collections of these comics, and there's not a single, for example, state institution which would hold them. So maybe it's one of the things that we should look in the future to collect all the comics from the 1930s, 1940s, and bring them to some of the Serbian institutions,
Yes.
so that it will be available again.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes. Maria Samardzic says, I still have that mammoth tooth.
Okay.
You're talking about 30s. If I'm not mistaken, there was almost an diplomatic incident between the United States and the Kingdom of Yugoslavia over Mickey Mouse cartoon, when it was featured during the time of after the killing of Alexander, the King of Yugoslavia, and Prince Pavle was in charge until the young King Peter II was able to rule the country. I think that Mickey Mouse had a cartoon called Mickey Mouse as a Monarch of Mediocre.
Yeah.
And Karađorđević dynasty saw some kind of meddling in their affairs, and Mickey Mouse was basically forbidden from 1934 until 1946, I believe, and it was during the time of the communist regime that it was reinstituted.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting case. Not all Mickey Mouse comics were forbidden, but just that story. And that particular story seemed very much like describing the situation in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. It was most probably just a coincidence, but anyway, that story was banned from the papers, and it wasn't published until I think maybe 1980s or something, when it was reprinted in its entirety. Before that, it was censored, and it made even some kind of a diplomatic dispute because of this. And it's one of the rare cases where actually Walt Disney Production was having a situation like that in a foreign country. But we should say maybe it's also interesting that there were early essays on comics in the 1930s and the 1940s, mostly written by the left-wing people in Serbia, and most of them were talking about Walt Disney as a good example of the quality comics, and they were quite positive about, for example, Mickey Mouse comics, which were then very much popular, because they thought that it was actually speaking about the human condition, and that these humanized animals are actually speaking about the situation in the capitalistic system where people are being exploited and stuff like that, which today it would be funny because in our age, Disney is more observed as something which is coming from the tradition of the right wing, of the imperialistic point of view. But back then in the 1930s, Disney was actually considered progressive, at least by the thinkers from the left wing in Serbia. Yeah. I think maybe also in a few other countries, but that is also one of the oddities of these times.
Thank you. We have 1 minute. I see, Nina, you have a couple of lines here. Says Nina Couch would like to answer this question live. So here you can take from, I don't know.
I didn't know I wanted to answer a question live. But I did want to say, David Lasky actually has a comment that I think is a nice one to sort of let Pasha end on. I had the good fortune to visit Pančevo in 2013 and attend the comics festival that Sasha helps to organize. It's a beautiful town with a complex history and an inspiring festival. I want to encourage my fellow American comics creators and fans to visit. So Sasha, lots of kudos for a variety of reasons. And we want to thank you so much for your time. This has been really inspiring for all of us. On behalf of Ohio State University Libraries and our Area Studies Department, thank you so much. We really appreciate this wonderful lecture.
I would just like to say something at the end. If any of your viewers actually have something interesting, if they have found something on the flea market or just anywhere, they should try to contact me. They should maybe just scan these findings and send it to me. There is a chance that I might use it in one of my stories.
Wonderful. You don't know what you'll be getting.
Great, great.
That's
I'm looking
great.
forward to it, yes.
All right. Well, thanks everyone who joined us. Thank you again, Sasha. This was really great. We really appreciate it.
Hvala najlepše, čućemo se, vidjet ćemo se.
Čućemo se.
Bye.